7:01, so we'll start. I'm Jenny Wong, and Anna Lazzarini had asked us to set this up, and she did a lot of the legwork, and we have Jeff Leiken today, who will be talking to us about transitioning to high school. And he is somebody who's really familiar with our community and the kids and that they face and handle at school. And I wanted to just introduce Jeff a little bit. He is the creator of Evolution Mentoring and the founder of Evolution Mentoring International. He's worked with over 45,000 youth, parents, professionals in 17 countries and 4 continents. He's done many speaking engagements, a number for us, and then also Tam High School District as well. So again, he's not only familiar with our community, but where the kids are going to be going, whether it's Tam High or Redwood. He understands that whole Tam High School District. And he has presented different guest lectures for TED Talks, guest lectured at Stanford University, keynoted at hundreds of conferences around the world, and done 300 summer camps in North America and China. He's also the author of the book entitled Adolescence is Not a Disease, and that's available on Amazon. And middle school community, he's facilitated 8th grade boys and girls mentoring groups for students for over 15 years. So definitely has a long history with our community. His specialty is private practice, and he offers a really unique mentoring to teens and young adults who are thoughtful and sensitive and understands the challenges that they're going through. He's based in Marin County, but he also works with clients all over the world. And just as you might have heard us talking about, he's now doing Zoom. So, which means he can reach you anywhere. We're really happy to have him today to share some of his thoughts about transition. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then he'll open it up to questions, which we'll take from the chat.
All right.
So turn it over to Jeff.
Okay, so if I'm doing this right, can you see my
Yes.
there? Okay. And I was just saying, if you just joined the call, I've also figured out one of the options on the thing is you can hide self-view so you don't have to see yourself. I was saying that since I started doing this stuff with groups of teenagers, them seeing themselves as like this whole extra layer of insecurity and awkwardness, whatever. So I'm kind of teaching them how to block that stuff out. So anyway, well, thank you for inviting me. And I hope, in the half hour or so, I'm just going to try to lay out some, not just sort of large scale stuff, but even some specifics as you're thinking about, as your kids are graduating 8th grade and moving on into high school, and then the really kind of warp speed journey that goes into college and beyond. And just so you have a little bit of background about this is that I have worked with teenagers for about 25 years. I kind of fell into it because I grew up going to summer camp, and my last couple of years of working at summer camp, I was just working with the older kids, and it was sort of a natural transition to go work in the schools. And eventually I went to graduate school and I worked in the public schools in San Francisco, and I was just working with high school kids. And I just began to see this pattern again and again with teenagers, that there's this forces at play in their life. And so one of the ways that I speak of this, and if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me reference this before, is that early in our lives, like I literally just an hour ago got a FaceTime call from an old client of mine who's in her early 30s now, just had her first child, and she, gets on the FaceTime with holding up her little baby, and the baby spit up and all that stuff. And I told her that I'm pretty convinced the reason that we're all sleep deprived during early childhood is because if we remembered all that stuff, we wouldn't want to keep reproducing and having kids. But, at that age, when her child's 3 months old, in the first couple of years, really the only voice in a child's life is their parents. And it's not just the voice that calms and comforts them. It's also where they start learning the basic things of like please and thank you and right and wrong and manners and, how to behave appropriately in the world. And for most of us, that's a very small circle. Maybe they go to childcare, but a lot of it is just parents, grandparents, select babysitters who are going to reinforce the things that we value and the messages we want to give them. And as they get older and they move into the school age years, they start to get exposed to what I refer to as the second voice in their life. And the second voice is not just one person, it's a collective. It's the other children in school. It's quite literally the language that other people use, the the things they learn from them, the messages they get, the music that they listen to, the TV shows that they watch. And as they get older, and obviously for most of our kids this past 3 months or so, there's been a lot of time on screens. It's just endless exposure to people other than us. Endless exposure other than, the teachers or whatever who, we would most want them to be listening to. And so as kids grow up and they start saying, well, mom and dad, say don't drink, don't smoke, but everybody else out there is saying drink and smoke, they start to get this, these questions inside their head about, well, who should I be listening to? And in these moments when they're making decisions, they're either going to hear your voice or they're going to hear one of these other collective voices. That just becomes this cacophony of noise that's out there. And so that's where our kids are at this life, is influenced heavily by the second voice. What I do, just so you understand this, is that I took the position of, I think what a lot of teenagers need is a third voice in their life. I think that oftentimes as parents, we give great advice, but we can be the wrong source. They need to hear it from people who they view as not having an emotional investment in them, or people who they view as more hip or more in tune with the current world. And so I created this practice doing this mentoring work where I'm, fundamentally teaching the kids I work with a way of life. And you'll hear some stories of this because it's really how I have the view that I have into the world of adolescence, is the countless stories, the late night text messages, and the things that they go through as they go through the high school years. And it's not just the messages from the kids, it's also from their parents. Just today alone, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, just 2 phone calls I had with parents today of high school boys and some of the challenges that are going on right now. But to me, there's this extraordinary value in having a third voice in your life who is a responsible person, who knows the terrain, but is not your friend and is not your parent. And there's a huge void in the world because many teenagers don't have that. So therefore, there's a lot of figuring things out through trial and error or listening to other people. And the challenge we have as parents is trying to continue to remain a voice who they will listen to as they're growing up and going through this stage, as they're beginning to find their own path in life and grow into the adult they're going to grow into. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So one of my things is I don't like this tendency, like the BuzzFeed thing, the way we sort of take really complex things and oversimplify them. It feels good, but life isn't really that simple. I also don't like the way we take things that are really simple and overcomplicate them. And so I'm going to make a statement here that's oversimplifying, and I acknowledge that. But I think there's enough truth to what I'm going to say that you can sort of see where your kids fit into one of these categories. I look at schools, and because this conversation has to include the conversation about going to high school, institutions that we use to raise our youth. And I understand that institutions are by definition imperfect, right? It's it can't meet everyone's needs perfectly all the time. And the system that's originally been set up, the sit in rows and raise your hand and get permission and learn to become compliant and stuff, is an ancient system. It doesn't really fit into the flow of spontaneity and getting up and moving around, and the way that some of these more progressive companies operate right now, where they're very into collaboration and working together and stuff. I mean, we're still operating out of a kind of an archaic model that's having to quickly adapt to the new world, add on this layer of what's gone on the last 3 months. And so I look at this system and I think that it's kind of like this, that for about 1/3 of the students, it works just fine. Academics are easy enough to them. It's not a source of tremendous stress, whether because they can just easily get A's or because they don't have parents who put tons of pressure on them, so B's are okay. The social life comes easy enough, and they have a good enough social life that they're pretty satisfied and pretty content. And the extracurriculars are interesting, and they can satisfy them enough. So they have enough activity that they do. And for about 1/3 of the kids, school's fine. They will be fine. The worst you're going to deal with is, maybe some frustration that they procrastinate too much, whatever, but they pull it off and they do okay. For another third of the group, maybe the academics come easy to them, but the social stuff is hard. Or for them, maybe the academics are really, really hard for them, but the social comes easy for them. And sometimes you have kids that, you know, the academics are fine, the social is fine, but their interests are such that school just doesn't meet their needs. It's just not going to address the things they really want to be learning. But it's not awful, because at least some of the basic stuff of going there isn't a source of stress to them. Which leaves the third group, which is kids for whom academics are challenging, the social life is stressful for them, and the extracurriculars aren't meeting their needs. And for those kids, ironically, in a way, those kids will, if it's academics, will get the most support, but it's also for them oftentimes the school is the hardest. I remember this one boy a number of years ago I worked with, went to San Rafael High School. And I realized after about 3 conversations with him that he was in this third category. School academic was hard. The social world was confusing to him. He just constantly felt like everybody's moving at 55 and he goes at 45. So he just misses the joke, or is, you know, not there when he needed to be there to get invitations. And he played on the football team, but he wasn't that good, you know, so he sat at the end of the bench kind of thing. And what he looks at me when he goes, basically, Jeff, to sum it up for you, school is hell. And I think there's a lot of kids who have that kind of experience. And if you're a parent raising a kid like that, first of all, you already know it. But your journey is different of how do you raise that child, or if they're in that second category, how do you raise that child so they're still going to be able to thrive as adults, even though the primary institution you rely on may not have all the resources that you need with it. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that are going on as they're stepping into this next stage of life. First of all is the academic reality of high school. And it isn't just the public schools, by the way, that I'm familiar with around here. I have a lot of kids I work with who go to the private schools, whether it's, you know, really kind of an alternative small school like the Marin School to kids who are at Branson, Marin Academy, Urban, those kind of places. But I do understand the TAM and the Redwood world really well. So I understand what the academic experience is like, because I have conversations with kids all the time. The second thing is about what's going to go on their social journey, because that's equally as relevant, and I would argue even more relevant for many kids. And then the third thing is just their own personal journey. What happens now that they're fully in puberty and fully into their adolescence? So we are in an education model here that is primarily driven by the AP curriculum. You could say schools around the country are following the AP curriculum, but there are a lot of schools out there that have a lot more alternative program to them. A school like TAM or a school like Redwood is primarily with the expectation that you're here to go to college. So you're on a college track. So not only are you going to be doing the universal high school requirements of 4 years of English, 4 years of math, but you're also probably going to do 4 years of science and 4 years of foreign language, and you're going to do AP classes and that stuff. And there's a fair amount of pressure that kids feel to follow that particular curriculum. And that the challenge with the AP curriculum is that whether you're literally taking the AP classes or you're taking just 4 years of the basic English, is it shows no mercy. The curriculum is the curriculum. Common Core designed it that way, you know, so that the idea is you could pick up and go to any high school in the country as a junior and pick up, you know, the curriculum, and you'd be on target with it if you're in a conventional school model. So the curriculum is what the curriculum is. The reading is what the reading is. The writing, the expectations. Obviously, the AP classes are going to be more challenging, you know, higher level of work with it. But the curriculum shows no mercy. So the thing I say about it, though, is the curriculum shows no mercy, but teachers do. Okay, and I find that the experience that we've all had along the way through elementary school, and I have a 13-and-a-half-year-old and a 7-and-a-half-year-old myself. So, you know, I've had my kids in school, and I've had teachers who I've clicked with and loved, and I've had teachers who I've gone to battle with over time, right? But for the most part, most of the teachers that our students come in contact with really do understand that there's a lot demanded of them, that it's not an easy curriculum, that there isn't a lot of wiggle room for them to modulate and, you know, play around with like what the curriculum is. But I do find overwhelmingly at the public schools and even at the private schools here, teachers can be actually very accommodating and very patient with students if the student demonstrates that they're taking it seriously and they sort of approach them in the right way. And so, you know, by middle school, your kids already know this. There's certain teachers they like, certain teachers they don't like. They see the world clearly enough to understand that there's certain teachers who play favorites and have flaws and have moods and all the kinds of things that they have to recognize. But it's really important for them to understand that going in from day one and establishing yourself with the teachers that you are a kid who does take school seriously, that you'll be respectful to them, you understand the challenge that they have teaching, makes you more likely to be somebody the teacher's going to be more accommodating and flexible with along the way. So day one, if you go in and you're just looking for your friends and you want to be talking in class, is not the best move. To go in day one and just be quiet and, you know, get to know your teachers and make a good impression is a good strategy. And from the parent standpoint, parents who are gracious and supportive, who work with teachers as if I'm a partner with you with this, tend to have a much easier time getting, you know, flexibility and leverage and opportunities from teachers. Parents who have a tendency to go into the mode of the teacher's the enemy are going to be more likely to get the fight back from the teachers. And you can imagine what it's going to be like to be a teacher in a community like this, where you have a lot of parents who can be very demanding and high maintenance and that kind of stuff. So it's like not to be submissive and quiet and complacent with teachers, but it's to reach out and build a relationship where you know, work with them and demonstrate that you're willing to work with them. Because I find that when November rolls around, December rolls around, all of a sudden you get the email finding out that your son is missing 3 assignments and they're on the verge of not, you know, getting the grade you want. You're far more likely to get a teacher who's willing to say, well, I'll tell you what, if you do this, I'm willing to work with you with this or whatever, than when you become that pain in the ass parent who, you know, they have to smile at, but inside their head, there's things that they're thinking, but not saying, you know. There's you know, teachers are human too, right? So never has that been more evident than in this last couple of months, okay? So the secondary piece to it also is that students who take responsibility are far more likely to get teachers to be flexible with them and give them more chances and be more forgiving when those moments come where they did forget an exam or they did fall behind or something like that. One of the comments I oftentimes make with my teenage clients that I work with is, you know, it's okay if you forgot to hand something in or whatever and you use an excuse for it, but if you become the person who's constantly using excuses, then your excuses lose credibility, right? So it's far better for you to just, you know, own up to, you know what, I had a huge exam I was studying for and I completely forgot to do this assignment. It's completely my mistake. You're far more likely to get a teacher who will be forgiving and give you an extension, give you more time, or at the very least, be more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt at the end of the semester than if you go in and you're just making up excuses about how you couldn't log into the website. You know, I had a boy I work with who, freshman in college, and didn't hand in a final paper first semester when it was supposed to be handed in. And what happened was the curriculum that the teacher had given out at the beginning of the semester said you're supposed to hand the final paper in during the final exam period, which was 2 to 4 p.m. on a Friday. And the boy hands the paper at 3:45 p.m. The teacher doesn't accept it because she said, no, it has to be in at 2 p.m. And he says, but, you know, the syllabus says between 2 and 4 p.m. And she says, yes, but last week in class, I told people it needs to be at the beginning of class. And he says, well, I wasn't in class. I was sick that day. So he has this whole back and forth. And when she finally responds to the email that I helped him craft, she says to him, you know, I would be far more forgiving and understanding with you had you not also missed 5 other classes of mine throughout the semester and missed 2 other papers that you asked for extensions on, right? And this is an example of a kid who didn't learn this lesson in high school. So it's just important that kids understand this. You know, yes, there's a lot expected. Yes, teachers can be flexible, but they're far more likely to be flexible if you present yourself as somebody who takes learning seriously, respects that there's a lot of work on teachers also. So a lot of coaching for kids about how to go in and advocate for themselves, but how to do it in a way that's not accusational, how to do it in a way that is respectful is a really valuable skill to be teaching your kids at this age. The more they do it themselves, you know, the less you do it, the better. And I see this across the board in high schools. Teachers far prefer to be emailing the student directly than having to involve parents in it. I have this formula, and I've been running these groups at the middle school with 8th grade boys for 15 years. I've been doing it with girls for a couple of years now also. Some of your sons may have been in the groups that I run, but one of the things that I talk about them, because it's just a mentoring group, it's not a therapy group, right? I talk to them about my 4-step plan to how to ensure you never get lower than an A. Lower than a B. I don't know, on your screen, like all your images are covering the B that's up there. So it actually says lower than a B ever again. And I go, it looks like this. First thing is do all the work and hand it in. And any of you who have, especially sons who have backpacks full of papers, you know what I'm talking about, right? Where they've done it and don't hand it in. Number 2 is figure out what's on the test and study and know that. Number 3, figure out what the teacher loves and do that, and figure out what the teacher hates and don't do that. And as kind of as silly as it sounds, it's actually a really valuable skill for them to be learning in high school, because the work is more challenging, there's more of it, and they have to start to learn that, maybe in middle school, the teachers would tell you and do reviews of everything that's going to be on the quiz that's coming up. But as you get older, you have to start figuring out what are they actually grading for. And you have to start to learn to be able to realize like what you really need to be putting your time and attention into and what you don't need to put your time and attention into. So, when you have the teacher who almost every quiz comes from the stuff that's in the textbook, read the textbook really well. When you have a teacher who almost every question comes from the class discussion, then pay attention to the class discussion. And if you miss a class, ask people what was talked about. Don't just think you're going to go read the book and get it, to do well. These are like skills that they need to start learning as soon as they get into high school. Got to hit the ground running with it. You have a teacher who loves students who ask lots of questions, show up prepared with questions. And I do a lot of this, like, English teachers who like, you read something, come in with the questions, like read enough of the chapter that you can go in and raise your hand and ask a question that shows that you've read it. If you have the teacher who likes people to just be quiet, don't talk in those classes, right? But these are these strategies about learning how to succeed as you get into this system, because as you get older, they expect you to be able to handle more and more. So the second, major component of what goes on right now is the evolution of their social lives. And you've already seen it. Most of you have already seen this. Some of you may have late bloomers in terms of the social world. You may have some boys or girls who still, want to just stay home and not go out and socialize much or whatever. But for the most part, probably by this point in 8th grade, you're seeing them paying more attention to social media and what other kids are doing, them desiring to have more social time to hang out with friends, more of that need for privacy, to close the door and have you, not so involved in their lives and stuff. And it makes sense because brain development wise, they're really functioning in the part of the brain that's really about learning about relationship and connection. And at this stage of life, as I see it, as the journey through adolescence, this is really the first stage of adolescence. This is where they've left behind, I'm not a child anymore, but I'm not yet fully an adult. And in this particular stage of adolescence, what happens is this question that's driving them is, there's this social world. These are the people I'm going to have to live my life with. How do I navigate this social world? Where do I fit in this social world? Where in the ranking of social hierarchy do I fall? What are the rules of the game? How do I play by the rules? How do I learn, how to get certain ins or how to get certain outs, how to get noticed or how to be invisible? And these are all these things that they start learning because they know you can no longer protect them. Again, when they're, 2 and 3 years old, we are their world. Something happens, they come running to us, right? At this age, they're less likely to come running to us. So the question is, where do I fit in the social world? And the deep underlying question is ultimately, am I cool enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I appealing enough? And you start finding at this age, wanting to get up earlier to shower and do makeup and get dressed properly, and you're sitting here worried about getting to school on time and they're more concerned about their hair. I've noticed this with my 13-year-old who's doing these Zoom calls and, actually, the other day, I was bringing her with me somewhere to drop something off somewhere. And she's like, but my hair's not done. I'm like, what difference does it make? We're just rushing out to go drop something off, but that's the thing that happens, right? And it all is because this desire to understand the social world. So at this stage of life, because there's such a compelling draw and desire and need to understand the social world, it's also when social things go on, it becomes like red alert to them. It becomes this thing that dominates. It can trigger the fight flight response in their brain. And so you can have a child who, has a big paper that's due, an exam that's coming up, and they should be studying and should be focused on it, but something happened with a friend that day, or, they weren't invited to something, or, they sent a text message and didn't get a response to it. And things that you and I look at and we go, it's just not that big of a deal. You have this quiz tomorrow, but to them, it's a big deal to them. And if you as a parent at that stage of life are constantly telling them, this doesn't matter, this doesn't matter, this doesn't matter, what happens is you very quickly go into the category of people who don't get it. You want to stay in the category of people who get it and also understand that you have your social needs, but you also have these other things you got to get done in the world. So a lot of times at this stage of life, what they need help with, and you can just see there's some text messages that just is from the last couple of weeks. One of them is, hey, Jeff, you're on to talk. And this was a boy who had broken up with his girlfriend, and all of a sudden she was texting and wanting to get together again. Bad idea, Another one is, hey, had a bit of a code red situation that was sent to me at 10 o'clock at night. This just is an example of teenagers, right? 10 o'clock at night having a code red situation while on shelter in place, okay? And in that particular situation, something was going on with some social thing with a girl or something like this, with a boy who sent that to me. But I've established with the kids I work with a code language. I mean, quite literally, like in this case, it's code red. If something's going on that really, truly is urgent, that you just cannot, do this stuff right now, you need time or whatever, you can establish that with me. I've had parents who have kids who just are really sensitive and can get really stressed out easily, and they've established with their kids, if there's just a day that for whatever reason you can't be in school, you can call me and tell me this is one of those days, and I'll excuse you and you can come home. As long as you're going to, get your work done or whatever, and it's not happening all the time, like I'll be there for you in that regard, because sometimes it just gets that way. And if they don't have that option, then what happens is they're sitting there trying to stay in school, trying to stay focused, trying to get their work done, while this thing that's really weighing on them and stressing them out is going on. So it's really helpful to recognize when something is happening that's weighing heavily on them socially, and you support them with it. For me, so support means helping them with decisions, helping them develop skills, telling a teenager something like, why don't you just go talk to your friend about it? It's not helpful. Telling them, here's 3 different ways you could go talk to them, and then giving them the exact kind of language is helpful. Really valuable to do that stuff. A lot of times when I'm working with a teenager and they have to have a difficult conversation with someone, a friend who betrayed them or didn't invite them, to something that should have been invited to, these kinds of things that come up that can be really red flag experiences for a young teenager. I'll give them like 3 different examples of how you could say this to the person, beginning with the nicest, sweetest, softest way imaginable, and ending with like in your face, direct, blunt, bold. So it's like a range of ways that you can handle a situation. And I'm putting so much emphasis into this because parents, in my experience, who really understand their kids' social needs weigh heavily on them, are compassionate about it, are patient about it, and are able and willing to offer them really practical advice, tend to be the parents whose kids keep talking to them through the high school years, tend to be the ones whose kids have the easier time navigating their way through it. Parents who are dismissive of it, parents who give cliche advice at best or just express their frustration, tend to be the ones whose kids go underground with the problems and issues that they have. And one of these things I put on here is the first love endorphins. Again, some of you have probably already experienced this because there's people having relationships in 7th and 8th grade. But a lot of times in this early high school years is when they do start to suddenly have their first boyfriend, first girlfriend, first serious kind of relationship. And it can be really, really frustrating as a parent because the endorphins that kick in and the hormones that kick in, and it's like, you watch them like having the stupidest arguments and fights with this girl and the stupidest arguments and fights with, going on and on and on and wasting all this kind of stuff. But you have to remember, like, that's what it's like at this age, right? Is that these things are just so intense and it feels, there's no bigger perspective, right? So it's like it happens. It just feels so overwhelming as this stuff happens. So it's really important to recognize as your kids are beginning to enter into that, which some do by this age, you have to be prepared to be patient with it. You know, you coming along and just saying like, well, that girl's not good for you is not, helpful. You saying, listen, relationships are complicated, and why don't you focus on this stuff right now? And over the weekend, we can sit down and we can talk about it. That kind of stuff, you're more likely to have them listen to you and have a more balanced approach to keeping up with all the other responsibilities as well as handling the school challenges. One of the journeys, that they go on at this age is finding their people. I always talk about how the journey to adulthood is finding your people, finding your voice, and finding your life direction. And this early stage going into ninth grade or so is really about finding your people. I mean, quite literally, it's who am I going to have lunch with? It's who am I going to hang out with on the weekends? It's who am I going to trust? Who am I going to associate with? And I tell kids, like, sometimes you have these friends that you grew up with going through elementary school and into middle school who were your best friends and you thought you'd be friends for life. But as it's happened, as you get older and they grow, they change, they become different people. Some of them go down a road that you don't want to go down. You don't want to associate with them anymore. Sometimes your interests change and they don't want to be around you anymore. And you go on this new journey of finding your people. And it can be really tough as a parent if you watch your kid go from having plans and sleepovers all the time to maybe not having those plans. Seeing, people that become part of your social world because you become friends with their parents and all of a sudden your kids don't associate anymore. And you want to have a dinner and they're, not wanting you to invite those people. These things you have to be prepared for that happen. But supporting your kids and just letting them know, listen, friendships change, people change. Most people, if you look at when they make the best friends in their life, it generally starts from about 16 on. It's when you have enough sense of who you are, and that's going to remain constant. You start finding people who are like that, So I remind them a lot to be ready for friend groups to change, and especially if you have friends who are going down a road that you don't necessarily want to go down. And the last piece of this is that you really start to see the beginning of this personal journey into this question begins to emerge about who am I? Where am I going in my life? For most teenagers, and I really see this as a brain development thing. The question can emerge younger, but for most of them, it doesn't really kick in until somewhere about 15 and a half to 17 years old. And something happens around that age. It's almost always around 16. I've even joked about how one day I'm just going to write a book called 16 because of how many calls I get from parents and how many 16-year-olds I work with struggle with this stuff, where they start really starting to have the sense of like, I am my own person. And I've got to make decisions for myself about what I want to do and where I want to go to college and what I want to study, or maybe I don't want to go to college. And as a parent, you start to see sometimes these interests that they take on, and the question begins to emerge, well, what do we do if, some of their interests are things that we don't really like? If they get into things that you have very strong judgments against, and all of a sudden you can have this very divisive thing with your child because they view you as being small-minded or simple-minded, or, you only love me if I go, to the kind of college you want me to go to and get a degree that you're, can brag about, that kind of thing like that. So it's really a, thing as a parent to recognize that they're all on their own journey. We are all on our own journey. And we want to be able to recognize the signs when these things are happening. And it's more valuable to sort of recognize, I've noticed recently you've been reading more about that stuff, or you keep bringing that stuff, like what's going on? Like, what are you thinking about that? What's happening with it? And be less inclined to be imposing your opinion and more inclined to just listen, right? I find one of the more valuable things you can say with a teenager when they have a problem or something is you listen to them, you can validate. I understand why, you'd be pissed off at your friend. It was a really tough day or whatever. But rather than tell them, why don't you go do this? It's really valuable to say something more along the lines of, I'm happy to give you my input if you'd like it. If you want some suggestions from me, I'm happy to give. If you want me to just listen, I'll just listen. And most of the time they're actually going to say, I'd like to hear your opinion. But at this point, you're giving them the power to ask for it, you're not the parent who's imposing it on them. And again, this positions you as more of a person they're going to continue listening to, right? So part of the whole thing about, this personal journey is recognizing that there's just times along the way where they're going to have to go out of their comfort zone. And in order for them to either really truly pursue the things they want to pursue in their life, or just build the confidence that they want to build, or have the quality of relationships they want to have, they're going to have to willing to step out of their comfort zone. And sometimes that's really as small a thing as just the willingness to go have a conversation with somebody that's a really difficult conversation to have. And sometimes what it means is you're going to have to go sign up for a class and be the only one in that class. None of your friends are going to be in it, but you're going to be on your path, living your life, doing your thing, doing it your way. So we need to be supporting them and recognizing that there's a lot of things that they have to do at this point. They're out of their comfort zone that to us, we easily step out of our comfort zone to do. For them, it feels really, really big. And some of it ultimately will be very, very big. But it demands a tremendous amount of compassion to really step back and remember what it's like to be that age. Where things that come easy to us now didn't at that age, and they don't for our kids either. So being very, very encouraging and supporting to them when that stuff happens. But ultimately, as I tell them, ultimately, to get the highest quality of life you want to have, you have to be willing to step out of your comfort zone. Not all the time, but enough. So I'll kind of wrap this up here, and I'll tell you a quick story. A number of years ago, I was on an airplane flying to Atlanta from San Francisco. And I'm sitting next to this elderly woman who had really bad arthritis, and her hand, like she couldn't really use her hand and stuff. And I just being, trying to be polite or whatever, she was trying to take the tray table out. And I said, "Oh, can I help you with it?" She said, "Oh yeah, thank you." And I helped her with it. And I had my laptop out and I was editing my book, and she could see some of the chapter titles and stuff, but she's this woman probably in her mid to late 80s. And at one point, as we're coming into land, she says to me, "You've been very nice and very helpful." And she goes, I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be writing a book about teenagers, or, reading some about teenagers. And I said, "Yeah, this is work I do." And we chat a little bit about it. And she says, "My daughter wrote a book about me." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. How come?" She goes, "Well, our story is that I had 4 kids, and my husband got sick and died when I had 4 young kids at home. And I managed to work 3 jobs and raise all 4 kids, all 4 of whom grew up out of, difficult circumstances, went on to college. 2 of them are corporate executives. One of them is the, major partner in a law firm, and one of them is one of the chief doctors at Stanford Medical School, at Stanford Medical Center." She goes, "I'm actually on my way back from visiting him right now." And my daughter, when she became a parent and she realized like how hard it is to be a parent, she says, "Mom, I really want to write a book about you because you did something amazing. Like, against all these obstacles, you raised each one of us to be very focused, very driven, very morally centered people." And she says, people hear about this, and she goes, "Very often they tell me like, 'Oh, you must be an expert in parenting.'" And she says, "I look at everybody, I tell them the same thing. I'm not an expert in parenting. I'm just an expert in being the parent of my kids." And I've always held on to that story, that I think all the advice and all the books we can read and all the different theories and all the, blogs we read that give us all this advice on the right way, and when should kids have social media, and when should they be able to date, and what should their bedtime be, and all that stuff. To me, while there's value in understanding these different perspectives on it, ultimately in the end, we as the parents have to become the expert on our own children. And we have to understand that what works for one of our children may not be what works for the other. I do a lot of work with summer camps. It's actually been an awful month in terms of the work I do with summer camps, because so many of these camps are closing right now. And it's just been really sad. But people always have asked me for years, because I've consulted all these camps and speak at all these conferences, like, "Jeff, where are you going to send your kid to camp?" And my answer was always, "It depends." And people go, "Depends on what? Aren't you going to send them where you grew up?" And I said, "It depends on who they are. As they grow and I begin to see what their interests are and what they like, I'll pick a camp that's actually appropriate for them." I'm not going to force them to go to the camp I want them to go. So I'm going to pick one that aligns with who they are. And so I think about this as our kids are going through high school about what are the opportunities that your son or daughter needs to help them grow and thrive? What are the resources and who are the resources you want to bring into their life? What's the timing of these things? Like, you know, in the ideal world, I think that by middle of freshman year of high school, they're waking themselves up in the morning. They're managing their time. They're, you know, communicating with teachers on their own. You're not doing that. School should not be dominating your relationship with your kids by going into high school, by the latest, by the middle of freshman year of high school. Just to me, that's the ideal. And I understand there are exceptions. I understand, you know, the kid who's ADD, who has trouble processing certain things, may need extra help, extra support. You waking them up, you reminding them, putting lists up. They may need that till they're 17 or 18 years old. And it's not useful to get lost in judging or feel like you're failing as a parent or they're being lazy. You just got to go, everyone's on their own journey. So what's the timing that you do certain things? You know, certain kids are ready to, you know, go off and get jobs and, you know, handle school without you being involved. Others, you have to find some way that you're involved in it. So I think about this and I go, this summer is really a tough one. There's not much available to be doing, but as you go forward, you think about summers and, you know, all the pressure comes in a community like this about college and that stuff. It's like, yes, and that stuff is relevant, I think. And it's even more important to go, if you're going to do something, make sure you do something that really fits your personality, fits what your interests are, because we can't just rely on institutions to raise our kids. It takes a village. It takes all sorts of different resources and community around us. And you have to know your kid to be able to make those kind of decisions for them. I'm just going to quickly say this about myself, and then I'm going to stop and go to questions and, you know, take questions stuff. But I do offer mentoring. I have an office, at least for another week. I'm trying to negotiate with the landlords right now on rent in Mill Valley, right above Starbucks across from the high school. For me, this transition to online has been, in my private practice, nothing, because 80% of my clients aren't in the Bay Area. They're all over the country and all over the world. So I'm constantly on FaceTime with them. But I do have a practice locally. And if you're interested in the work I do, my niche is really working with teenagers who are the ones who are thinkers and are more sensitive. The kids are a little bit more intense. It doesn't matter how social they are or not. It's just the kids who are more intense and more sensitive. Those kids I tend to work with. Somebody once described as like the smart, sensitive ones. That's really my niche. If you're interested, reach out to me. My book, as was mentioned in the beginning, is available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon online. I would say you could come get it at the front of the room, but we're on Zoom, so I can't do that. And then also, just in terms of like with the storm of stuff that's going on right now, I'm trying to offer just more resources and opportunities for people locally right now. I did a talk a couple of weeks ago for the TAM PTSA. Some of you may have been on that call. They've actually recorded it, so it's on their website. Just talking about the experience I've had from about 300 hours of conversations with teens since this whole pandemic began. And I'm trying to just offer some resources for parents to do some calls, or people can just call in and ask questions, and also doing some group programs for teenagers. So if you're interested, you want to know about that, on my website, I just put evolutionmentoring.com/TAM2020. You just go there and just put your name on the mailing list, and I'll email you privately about that. You know, just put you on the list and you'll just get stuff about it. Just want you to know that that's available, you know, as you're dealing with right now and also thinking about over the summer. So that's what I wanted to present. So, you know, the academic, the reality of going into high school, the social journey, and then being prepared for the personal journey with it as a transition to high school right now. What I'd like to do is I will take this off screen share, and we've set this up where people have questions. You can just put it in the chat box. They're just going to be moderated. It's too distracting for me to try to read all the questions and stuff. So, but I'll try to answer whatever you want. And then if there's, you know, anybody who has things they want to talk about that I don't have time for, so I'm just trying to end this stop share. Okay, I think I did that right. If anybody does, you can just reach out to me also, because I'm happy to be, you know, available as best I can. I realize this is kind of an unusual format. Normally somebody has a question, they can come up right afterwards and ask a question they want to ask you privately. You can't really do that here. So feel free to reach out. So All right. Well, I hope that was helpful. So, all right. Do we have some questions out there? I'll be quiet. You can, Jenny. Jenny, did you have questions? Or
I don't see a box. I don't see a box
I
where we can
know.
answer
You know what?
questions.
Heather, I was just seeing that too, that I was trying to do the same thing. And actually I was trying to troubleshoot that before we started. And yeah, for some reason that chat box is not working. That's so weird.
I
Oh,
see. Hold on. I'm seeing a bunch of stuff here.
yeah, I was gonna say, here we go. Now it is. Okay.
Maybe I just needed to do something. So, folks, if we didn't do this right, just if you want to put something in there, we're not in a rush. Okay. The only thing I'm going to do is turn on my air conditioner because my office is really hot right here.
Okay, so Jeff, I'm going to read this
yeah.
out. It's from Nikki. This is a great talk. Do you have any recommendations for encouraging your kids not to procrastinate? That is a very universal one.
Yeah. So I told you I could write a book called 16. I cannot tell you, since this whole online thing has happened, I've had, I can't tell you, emails forwarded to me from parents, phone calls from parents. You know, my son is missing 20 assignments, 30 assignments. One's missing like 45 assignments. You know, they say they're doing it and this stuff. I just want to tell you right now, especially if you have a son, because it seems to me that's more the pattern than it is with the daughters. And you're finding that it's hard enough to get them to do school when there is school and going to school. And it's really been a battle right now. You're not alone. It's not just them being lazy or something like that. It's really hard to do this work when you don't have the external context set up to make it work. And so one of the things that is valuable to come to your topic about not procrastinating, right, is they're just beginning to have the brain capacity and ability to process the idea of through time thinking, right? There's so much that's been written about frontal lobes, right, and executive function. And I think it's sort of almost overwritten about because it gives this idea that, you know, a kid who gets an IEP because they have executive function challenging is like, that's a, you know, crisis when it's not. It's very typical at 14 years old to have moments where you can, you know, plan the future really well and other times where you have no sense whatsoever of time. It's very typical at this age to get caught up in some kind of digital dopamine rush. They're playing video games, they're watching Netflix and just getting caught up in how good it feels. And then the transition from that to try to actually sit and do schoolwork, which is not fun, is a really hard transition to do. And so, you know, we're talking in the ideal world right now. The conversation to have would be, you know, what have you learned so far about what makes school easier or what makes it harder? So you get them to actually start processing that, you know, one of the things I've learned is that if I don't start doing my homework till 10 o'clock at night, you know, it just becomes harder and I'm sleep deprived or whatever, and helping them come to see that, right? So that they can start to be part of the conversation about how can we set up school so that you're more likely to have less stress, get the grades you want, and have more of the stuff that you want. So it's like less of the negative, more of the positive. One 8th grade boy who I had this conversation with about a month or so ago told me that he's realized that he cannot get work done when he's sitting in his bedroom. You know, and he goes, I take the laptop, I sit down in my bedroom, and the moment the door closes, you know, I just want to like watch YouTube and I want to whatever stuff. And so he decided to be much better off to either sit in the kitchen, or his dad has an office in the home, to go sit in the office with his dad and do schoolwork. And the dad, you know, was okay with that, except when the dad had phone calls to make, whatever. But it's useful at this age when you start to just realize that there's things you can do that will make it easier on you. You'll have less stress and more of the joy and more of the fun that you want. So you start that conversation earlier with them. So instead of it being you telling them, don't procrastinate, it's what's our strategy going to be that's going to help you to be, you know, get the results you want at school and have a lot more fun time with your friends. You know, to me, the worst thing is not do any work during the week and then you have to give up your whole Sunday, you know, to be doing schoolwork, when you could instead be able to sleep in and this other stuff, right? So it's start that conversation now, letting them begin to draw upon their own experience so they can begin to see the patterns of what doesn't work and what does.
Okay. One of the next questions we had was just that you mentioned about having a relationship with teachers, but from what I hear, high school teachers expect kids to advocate for themselves. How do you, as a parent, forge a relationship with high school teachers?
First of all, yes, high school teachers want students to advocate more for themselves. But it's not that they don't listen to parents. It's just not the case. And some of you have parents, some of you have kids already in high school, and you know this. If you as a parent go in and you present yourself as somebody who is supportive, who, wants their advice on what you can be doing and stuff like that, you start from that position, they're far more likely to include you in the conversation. There's a lot of recognition amongst teachers that this curriculum is demanding. But my thing is, again, I talk about this, like with the 8th grade boys who I work with, and 8th grade girls who I work with, that your ability to go in and start from the very beginning of establishing yourself as a person who shows me respect is far more likely to get me to be more flexible and accommodating with you down the road, right? So I start talking with them about, like, you're at this age now where the relationship that you have with all the people in your life is going to influence what you're going to get back from them. This is not a computer program where you type in this and it sends you back that. This is a real life person. And if you are the kind of kid who shows up and is respectful and is, appropriately, whatever, conversational, whatever in class, you're more likely to have a teacher who's going to give you, when you're between an 89 and a 90, they're going to give you the A instead of the B. It's just what's going to happen. Or when that time comes where you need extra help, whatever, they're more likely to give you the extra help, right? So I start teaching them not just that the relationship they have matters, but also learning, with each teacher, what's the kind of stuff you have to do to establish yourself as you're that kid. There's one of the summer camps I work with has this really brilliant training thing they do with their staff. It's a boys' campus, it's a male staff. And they talk about the idea of how there's always that guy. And we all know what that, there's always that guy who everyone's laughing, having a good time. And then that guy has to come along and say this, or that guy has to do this, right? And so they talk about, don't be that guy. And then the other side of it is, and then there's that guy who, whenever this is going on, everybody else is complaining, there's that guy who comes in and does this, knows how to have, raise people up or be playful or be positive, right? So be that guy, don't be that guy. So I talk about that with kids also. It's like, there's always those kids who, are going to get teachers being more patient with them, and there's always going to be that kid who, even though the work is really hard, there's going to be teachers who are going to give them more time or more whatever. You got to learn how to be that person. This is about learning how to work inside the system. You can't beat the system. Cheat enough, you're going to get caught. That's what happens. But you can learn how to work things in your favor. And there's power that comes from this. This is how I talk to them about it, right? So it's not lecturing from a moral, standpoint of like, you need to be a good person. It's like, look, this is how the world works. You want to get more of this, be more of this kind of person, and no one's asking you to compromise your core values in that regard. If in order what it's going to take is you're going to have to go in and pretend that you love Joe Biden when you actually love Trump or whatever. I'm not asking you to do that. I thought that'd be funny to say that to this crowd, but since all I see is names, I can't see anybody's laughing or whatever. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't funny, but you don't have to go that far, but there are a lot of things you can do that will work it in your favor. That's how I start talking about it. I hope that's helpful the way that I just said it. So.
Okay. The next question is, what is the best way to guide them towards trying new things without sounding bossy, and help them to get out of their comfort zone?
Far easier to do when you are doing it in alignment with things that they want. Right? So I always want to start there. Somebody, has an interest. It's far easier to get them to start working harder, putting themselves out there more when the end goal that they get to is something that's aligned with something that they deeply want, as opposed to when it's just something we think would be good for them, right? So I always want to start with, like, you know, things that you want. When it comes down to that, I'm trying to get them to step out of their comfort zone or develop these different habits because I think it would be good for them. You have to sort of play that card carefully. I look at this and I go, you know, as parents, there's few cards we can only play a couple of times before they no longer work. One of them is the "I'm disappointed in you." Right? If you hold on to that one and you play it just right in the right moment, it will have a lifelong impact. If you're constantly using that, it's got no effect, right? And one of the other ones is there are certain things in life that I'm going to ask you to do because I not only feel it would be good for you, I know it would be good for you. And I only get one chance to raise you. And I know sometimes some of these things are things you're not going to want to do. You're going to be furious with me. You're going to want to fight with me. But there's going to be sometimes on the way it's going to come up. It's not going to be every week. It's not maybe every month. Maybe once or twice in all of high school. But when those time comes, I'm not going to give up. There's going to be no flexibility. I'm going to want you to do it. And you're just going to have to trust that in the long run, you're going to look back and be glad that I made that choice to get you to go do that particular thing. And you hold on to that card and you play it wisely with that. How do you begin to set up just the mindset in general so that they begin to adopt that mindset is you get them to sort of unpack, right? So they get a role in a play that they wanted. They did the audition, they get the role, they're excited, you know, and they come to you. And in that moment, you celebrate, you're happy for them that they did it, right? They get the grade that they wanted, whatever it is. Afterwards, at some point, you sit down and you go, let's take a look at what worked, what got you there. And in that conversation, you start looking at what they did that worked, that made the difference. You point out that along the way, there were times you had to do things that were out of your comfort zone. You had to do things that, you know, were not easy to you. You had to do things that, you know, forced you to give up fun with your friends, you know, to be home working on your lines, right? And you start to point out to them that over the course of life, you will find that the path to success and getting stuff in life will require that. That's a common theme that's going to show up. In the end, the people who are going to have that kind of success in life are going to be willing to do the things that the people aren't successful are not willing to do. And that includes some of these things that you just have to do that are out of your comfort zone. So you sort of take a success they've already had and demonstrate how that success includes this along the way. And then you build on how that's going to be part of, you know, growing up and getting more and more in their life.
Okay, great. One of the other questions was, do you offer regular mentoring calls for the high school kids? And if so, what's the frequency? And how do you establish a mentoring relationship?
I'm happy to answer that. I mean, it is about my private practice. So I'm sort of sensitive to, like, this is a parent ed program for people, you know. Can I give you like a 60-second answer? And then if you're interested, you can email me, we can talk privately. My work is relationship based. So I don't rely on like techniques and stuff. I really rely on building a relationship that, in the beginning, I have to create it, and then I become a person that as they hit these transitional points on the way, I'm somebody who they will lean on and reach out to and turn to for guidance and support. And it's also part of his relationship with parents. So, you know, the way I work is in the beginning, I try to just have regular, you know, typically weekly conversations, get-togethers with them, building to a point where they will text me late at night, or they'll call me, or they'll get, you know, on FaceTime or whatever. You know, it's interesting because I have certain families I work with that in the beginning, it's like a huge leap of faith because this whole model is just a, you know, kind of an unusual kind of thing that I do because it's not paying me by the hour and stuff. And then all of a sudden it'll be like sophomore year and mom will walk in the room and be like, what are you doing on FaceTime? You have that big exam tomorrow. And they'll say like, oh, I'm talking to Jeff. And they go, oh, okay. And they walk out and then I get a text message. Is everything okay? You know, but I do what it takes to build a relationship. I work a lot with parents behind the scenes so that they can fill me in on things that are going on. And we can kind of strategize together is how I do this stuff. And when it's the right fit, it's pretty magical how it works. It really is cool. The girl who called me earlier today, who's now in her early 30s, approached me at a summer camp when she was 16 years old, and came to me and said, "Can I ask you something that's not about the talk you just gave, but it has to do with the problem I had in high school this past year?" And, from there, I ended up working with her and went to her wedding and gave a toast. And now, she's standing there holding her baby in her arms. So it's pretty cool, how this stuff works. So, but if you're interested, I'd say just reach out to me privately, because everything is nuanced, to the individual. So.
Okay. Another question was about developing a third voice from, sort of the resources within your family circle, either a teen in the neighborhood, or a parent, another parent, or an aunt, and how to kind of set that up. Yeah,
it's so, sometimes it's a common question, and it's to me, it's such an extremely valuable part of, the decisions we make as parents. Is like, who are the adults we bring into their life? Who are the people that they're going to turn to? I always sort of think about, my 7-year-old, comes to me, right? My 13-year-old right now, who's she going to turn to? And if I don't do things to establish other people in her life, she's going to turn to her friends. It's what's going to happen, right? In worst case scenario, sometimes they're turning to these, video bloggers or whatever, who are, I don't know what, can't trust where these people's intentions are, right? So I look at this and I go, ideally, if you have younger kids, you begin establishing the relationship at a younger age. You just have, friends of yours who occasionally, they just go out and hang out with, or take a walk with, or play around a golf with, or that kind of thing. And you make sure that when they're hanging out, the person begins to talk a little bit about life and about, more than just, playing golf or riding a bike together. If you have, if they have older cousins or something, or people who you trust, the input they're going to give them, you just ask them, listen, my daughter's at that point now where, she's starting to get into some stuff, and I know what's happening, and it'd be really helpful for her to have somebody a little older and wise to turn to. Could you begin to kind of build a little relationship with her? And, sometimes you have to do it kind of covertly, where that, they don't know that you've asked them to do that. One of my favorite stories, and again, people who've heard me speak before have heard this story, because it's just such a cool story, is that when this one father calls me up, and he's really concerned about his son. His son was 16, and he goes, "My son just doesn't have direction. He doesn't have, he's just kind of going through the motion. He plays in the lacrosse team, just not motivated, whatever." And I said to him, "Why don't you pick out 4 of your friends, adult friends, who are people who are really interesting, have really interesting life stories. And why don't you tell him he's going to take each one of them out to lunch individually, and just let him have a conversation with them," right? And the dad's like, "Yeah, how am I going to get my son to do that?" And I go, "It's simple. You tell him he's going to do it. You're playing that card of every now and again in life, there's something I'm going to ask you to do because it's good for you. This is that time." And you tell him, you give him, a little help. Like, here's some questions you can ask, and give him the money to pay for the lunch, right? So I said, pick people, go pick somebody who went to Harvard Medical School, okay? Pick somebody who dropped out of school and, is a 3-time failed bankrupt entrepreneur who's now a huge success story. Pick somebody who, maybe took 6 years to get through college. Pick different kinds of people. Don't just pick, the single archetype that everybody, knows about, right? And so the dad does this, and the friends were more than willing to accommodate. And my guess is, by the way, you probably would do that for one another. Some of you have friends who are in businesses that, have really interesting stories, whatever. So the son begrudgingly goes out with the very first parent, and he's nervous about it. And he's, cursing his dad. "This is a fucking stupid thing," and the man shows up. And so the son goes out with him, and they're gone for like 2 hours, right? The son comes back home, and dad's really nervous about this. Okay. Cause if it doesn't go well, he's never, you played that card, right? His son comes home, and he sits down. He goes, and dad's like, "So, how was lunch?" And he goes, "Dad, Mr. Johnson is like the coolest guy I've ever met in my life. Did you know?" And he goes on this, long story about this guy. And it got the kid excited about all these different ways that you can approach life and all the things it takes to be successful. And the question that I suggested the dad tell the son to ask was, at the end of every one of these meals, ask these people what books they recommend he reads if they want to learn to be more like them. And the son accumulates this list of books. And I know the son, by the way, the son, really, really cool kid. His name's Dan. Dan accumulates this list of books, and he goes, the interesting thing is not one of those books was on the high school reading list that I had to read all the way through high school. You know, these people are like reading different stuff and they're teaching me, and it gave him this sort of sense of power that comes from it. So I think you look at who's in your network, who's willing to do this. If you're picking people who are closer in age to them, make sure they're people who will share your values, will give it, a useful message. And you ask them to do this, and then you'd be willing to do it in return for them.
Okay, great. We also had a question about just the Tam High School District. I'm assuming it says there are several high school options in Marin. How do you counsel a family in finding the right fit for their kid? That's a loaded question, so I think that's a little hard.
Yeah, well, it's a loaded question because in general I don't. It's not what I do. I definitely have kids I work with who go to boarding schools. I don't mean, getting the call when somebody's in Utah. I mean, I've had some of those over time, but, kids who just decide they're going to go an alternative route. And, I had this one boy whose mom caught him. He was a sophomore at high school, really sensitive, creative kid who was just smoking a ton of pot, getting B's in school when he could have easily gotten A's. Had a job, but was just kind of lethargic or whatever. And about a month into me working with him, he says, you know what, I'd love to go to a boarding school. And his parents could fund it for him to go to boarding school. And he went, and he told me, he goes, the hard part about being in boarding school was giving up your freedom, because you can't go away every weekend. You have classes on Saturday and mandatory study hours and that stuff. He goes, but the best part of it was it made me see how insane this place is. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, Mill Valley, Southern Marin is insane. He goes, things that are normal here, the drugs, the heavy, people driving cars and like sneaking out of school, getting stoned, all this kind of stuff. He goes, it's not healthy. It's not, but here it's normal. And he goes, it's just crazy, right? So for him, it was like really good to get away. So those are conversations that I have with people. And sometimes you have kids, like one of the other ones that sort of become a very common thing is kids who have a tremendous amount of anxiety to the point where they're not going to school and missing tons and tons and tons of days of school to the point where parents are kind of forced to have to sort of go an alternative route. So personally, I mean, I have relationships with some of the people like at Fusion Academy and some of the superintendents around and stuff like that, but it's just not my sort of thing with that. I think you have to sort of talk to the schools to look into it. If there's people I can introduce you to, I'm happy to do it, but it's not like my thing with that. I'm only bringing these up because I'm really sensitive to, again, the institution of like public high school is fine for about 1/3 of the kids. They're not going to have an issue with it. For the remaining 2/3, it's anywhere from challenging to really brutal. And if you're in that remaining 2/3, you need to be prepared to provide extra resources to them, to be extra patient with them, and maybe even have to go an alternative route at some point with them. And in the end, if they get to a life where they're standing on their own 2 feet as an adult, and you're really proud of where they've gotten to, you'll look back and go, it was a hard journey, but thank goodness you did what it took to get them there. Because if you left it to the school alone, it wasn't going to be enough, especially the social challenges that the kids face. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good start. I would also say, Henry, definitely network with people that who have chosen different paths with their kids. That's always really helpful. Okay, and you know what? That is all the questions that I can see in the chat. Oh, wait, we just got another one. What suggestions do you have for families whose children are struggling with the lack of social interaction during COVID? Let me say, we all are.
Yeah, it's just, and I have like my younger one is, if you think of a continuum of extrovert to introvert, it's the world that we live in generally is far easier for extroverts because there's so much of our lives that are involved engaging with people, going to school, being around people. And if you get energized by that, it's so much easier. This shelter in place stuff is so much easier for all of us introverts. You know, my younger daughter is like on the highest end of introvert of it. I'm sorry, of extrovert anybody that I've ever known. She's the kid that we, go out to restaurants and she goes and sits at other people's tables and pulls up a chair and people go out to dinner with us and think it's weird. And I go, it's just what she does, So I understand this. It's been really, really hard. I did the whole talk, my TAM PTSA talk was about this topic. And what I would say is there's three things that are really, really, really important right now for just maintaining enough stability that when they can re-engage in the world, that they're not so far down that they're going to have to work just to get going again. And the three things are that they are staying physically active, especially being out in the sunlight, respecting the circadian rhythm, having movement physically and stuff in their lives, but having some sense of schedule that stays on sync with at least the sun rising and sunset when there's nothing else that's structured. The second thing is having whatever social contact that they can get. And even if that means with, boys, it's just chatting on video games or, they're getting on Zoom calls or FaceTime calls with their friends. A lot of times with teenagers, what's interesting is that they don't really know what to talk about. When they're out in the world and they're just meeting up and they go walk down to the depot and they go and they get coffee and they're, getting ice cream or getting pizza, whatever. And then all of a sudden, oh, let's go here. And then we're playing a pickup game of this or whatever. It's like there's conversation just flows. But when they sit there and it's not activity, they don't know what to talk about. So I've actually done a fair amount of coaching them on how to have conversations, like what to actually get people talking about. And some of these like things that they're doing right now, like this Netflix where you can be watching shows at the same time and like talking to each other, during it, is not really such an awful thing because it gives them something to talk about. But I've given them topics of like, like today I was having a conversation with a boy in Texas about his thoughts about the incident that just happened in Minnesota with the police officers and the black man who died and the guy, with his leg, on the guy's neck. And I said, it's just interesting because when you start talking to other teenagers, like they're reading these stories, they are seeing this stuff in the news and you can get people talking about that stuff. And it's a more lively conversation than just sending stupid memes back and forth to each other. So you have to kind of coach them on, how to be having conversations with people when it's just conversation, not activity, and understanding that just having family dinner or taking a walk together, that is still social contact, even though it's not, the stuff they want with their peers. So the first thing is exercise. The second thing is whatever kind of human interaction you can have. And the third thing is continuing to learn and use their brains to be learning things, because otherwise their brain goes stagnant. I like mindlessly be entertained, passive recipient of entertainment media is not engaging your brain. Figuring out like how to make your own video, that's using your brain. Writing your own script, that's using your brain. Learning how to teach yourself how to cook is using your brain. So it's like whatever you can get them to do that actually is of their interest, they can be learning. And I've got some kids I work with who are like teaching themselves foreign languages right now, just using like Rosetta Stone software, to do this stuff. So, but yes, it's really hard. It's harder for the extroverts and you have to be sensitive to it. You've got to make sure they're getting exercise and you've got to find whatever ways they can be interacting with people, even if it's, talking to grandparents on FaceTime, so.
Okay, that is great. I think that's really the end of our questions. We really appreciate the time of everyone. So thank you, Jeff. And then I will work on archiving the video of this. And you guys can always email me with any questions. You have my contact from the Eventbrite.
And I'm just going to add, like I said, if you, the evolutionmentoring.com/TAM2020, it's just to put your name and email address in, and I'll just send you some stuff so you know what I'm offering. But if there are some questions people have that you either couldn't put it in because it's too complicated or whatever, and you just want to take 10 or 15 minutes on the phone, I'm happy to do that. I've had a really special relationship with MVMS for 15 years now. They've really, I always, it's like they allow me a place to do my thing, to run these groups and to work with your sons and your daughters, those of you who, whose kids are participating. And I just have a real affection for the school and for the faculty and the leadership and the challenge that everybody's gone through. And so I'm always willing to sort of go over and above for the community there. So if you do want to reach out to me privately, just send me a quick email and I'll follow up with you. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. We really, really appreciate it. Have a great evening. Thank you for doing this virtually, and for all the work that you do for Tam High School District 2. We appreciate all of it. We really do.
Awesome. Okay.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. All right. Stop recording. Stop recording.